Cecilia, and this is my performance, Breaking the Barriers of Flooding, the 1937 flood and the Tell City flood wall. Welcome to Tell City, Indiana. Let me show you around our beautiful riverfront. Here's our lovely river where many people here go boating. Over here is our bike trail. If you look at the murals on the flood wall, you will see how our town was like long ago. Does the river ever flood, you ask? Oh, often, but it doesn't bother us all that much. Our flood wall keeps us nice and safe from all the floodwaters. Has the river ever flooded the town? Oh, yes. Quite often before we built our flood wall. The frequent flooding of the Ohio River built many barriers to growth and prosperity for the towns along its banks. In 1937, a flood larger than any other ever recorded in that area occurred, causing millions of dollars worth of damage and costing many lives. The people of Tell City received $800,000 worth of damage, and some industries in the town were damaged so severely that they never recovered. Shortly after the end of the flood wall, plans began on the construction of a flood wall that single-handedly broke the barriers the floods had created to prosperity, allowing the prosperous reason you see today. You want to hear more about it? Well, I can tell you what I've heard, but why don't I take you to someone who's there? This is Dot Tessner. She was there during the 1937 flood and will tell you all about it. Prior to 1937, there were large floods every couple of years. In 1884, a flood larger than any recorded in that region occurred with a crest of 50 feet 6 inches. In 1913, an even larger flood caused $160,000 worth of damage and cost 502 lives. The people of Tell City, among the people of other places, thought that the 1913 flood showed the highest floodwaters the Ohio could ever reach, but the 1937 flood proved them wrong. What I remember most of the 1937 flood was water everywhere. My family lived out in the country and we were not hit by the flood, besides some cousins who lived in town, and my grandparents had to move out to my house because of the flood. The water got into people's houses and they had to leave. They stayed at my church and also at the CCC camp. The people rode up and down the streets, helping the people who had stayed in their homes too long. They had to row in through the doors and windows, the water was so high. The night of 22nd, 23rd of January, the power and water were shut off. The newspaper, in their last issue before the office was flooded, warned people to stock up on water before that happened. All the businesses put their stock above the water, but they did move it up higher when the water kept rising. Our new post office was flooded. We all thought it would stay dry since it's about 6 feet off the ground, but the water went right up the steps and right into the post office. At the crest, the water was 53.74 feet. In one place in town, the water even got up to 8 feet and 10 inches. 8 feet and 5 inches, I mean. It took weeks, or possibly a month, to clean up all the water the flood left behind. And all the mud the flood left behind. Tell City was not the only town in Perry County to be affected by the flood. Carrollton and Derby, all the schools were closed. Carrollton's were closed for almost 5 weeks. The roads from Tell City to Dexter, Magna, and Rome were all flooded. But despite the flood, people kept living their lives, just in slightly different ways. My grandmother died and was buried during the flood, but there was also a baby born in his house during the flood, and another home and emergency operation successfully took place. Both these necessitated the doctor going out to the house in question. The Carrollton Baptists continued having their services, even though the church was cut off by the water. The pastor just rode out to whichever house they were having the service at that day. In Evansville, Indiana, and Louisville, Kentucky, the flood left its mark as well. In Evansville, Indiana, 10,500 were evacuated from their homes to live in Red Cross stations, hospitals, and boxcars. 2/3 of the city was flooded, with water reaching 60 to 70 feet above flood level. Temporary power lines were strung out to hospitals and Red Cross stations. Meanwhile, Louisville, Kentucky was even worse off. 175,000 were evacuated. Scores of unidentifiable bodies had to be buried in mass graves. Water was brought in milk cans, but there was only enough for drinking. During the 1937 flood, the river had flooded the Mississippi at Carroll, Illinois. $365 were killed, and an estimated 1 million were left homeless. Indiana fared better than most states. Not a single person in all of Indiana died of drowning. Volunteers from all over Indiana rushed to help the flood victims. Many of the flood refugees stayed at the Indianapolis 4-H Fairgrounds. The Indianapolis Recorder wrote, "Never before in the history of Indiana has a finer spirit of cooperation been manifest than during the needy times than have the citizens of Indianapolis shown during our state's greatest flood." In Tell City, Indiana, some industries were damaged so severely that they never recovered. One of our largest industries left for Franklin, Indiana. The total damages were over $800,000 worth. The year before the 1937 flood, in 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt had spoken to the U.S. engineers about construction of walls for the often flooded areas along the Ohio River. As you can imagine, the 1937 flood sped this up quite a bit. Shortly after the end of the 1937 flood, the Tell City City Council contacted the U.S. engineers from Louisville to talk about the building of a flood wall. The U.S. government agreed to pay for the wall's construction if the city provided the land. The wall was the first finished in the area on October 17, 1941. It had cost $1.1 million to build. The flood wall is 6,300 feet long, with a levee beyond that of 3,700 feet. 6 gates are built into the wall, with the supplies to close each gate off in a vault next to each gate. There are also 2 pumping stations to remove water from behind the wall. The next day, October 18th, was the dedication of the flood wall and pumping stations. My family was there. There were so many people there. We were all so glad that the flood wall prevents something like the 1937 flood from happening ever again. President Henry Stryker said, "By dedicating this here today, we are creating history which will be remembered for generations in the future. This flood wall is an improvement on the state of Indiana as well as on Tell City," he continued. "But most of all, this flood wall means protection to you, the people of Tell City." Places like Evansville and Jeffersonville still had their flood walls under construction, and some places along the Ohio had not yet started their flood walls. I hope I've been helpful. Did you enjoy talking to Galt Kessner? I'm glad. Has the flood wall been useful? Oh yes. Just 2 years after its construction, in 1943, the river flooded with a crest of 45.95 feet. Our town was completely dry, and even the basements of Main Street, which were so often flooded, were dry. 2 years after that, the river was again flooded, this time only 5.5 feet lower than the crest of the 1937 flood. Our town was completely dry. In 1997 and again in 2018, large floods occurred that, if it had not been for our flood wall, would have left our town several feet underwater. Thanks to our flood wall, today Tell City is the prosperous town it is. Just like how the flood walls in places like Hamilton, Louisville, and Evansville helped them grow and prosper as well. So hats off to the flood walls, the barriers to the flood waters that broke the barriers the floods created to prosperity.